In this lesson, we're going to learn about corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So if two figures are congruent, then all of their corresponding angles and sides must also be congruent. So what's important here is the fact that we're saying that the corresponding angles and sides are congruent if the two figures are congruent. So that really means that the angles and sides that match up or they're in the same position, those are the ones that are congruent. And sometimes it's easy to look at a picture and tell which are the corresponding parts, but other times it's not as clear cut. So one thing that's important to look at is the congruent statement. So the congruent statement is this right here where we say triangle RST is congruent to triangle XYZ. And what's important about that is the order of this statement, the order of the letters actually tells us which ones match up. So since R and X are both first, that means that angle R and angle X must be congruent. And then same thing for the middle letters here. So S and Y are both in the middle, so that means those match up. So that means angle S and angle Y must be congruent. And then lastly, T and Z are in the same position, so that means those match up, T and Z. So that means that those are also going to be congruent because they're corresponding parts of congruent triangles. Now, what's important too to just point out here, notice the arcs, the number of arcs I use. So R and X were congruent, so I used single arcs. And then once I went to the next pair of angles, I went to double arcs and then triple arcs. So that's important. And then from here, if I want to go further and talk about the sides, well, I can use my picture. I can say, well, the single to double arc, so RS, has to be congruent to the single to double arc angle XY. But you could also just look at your statement here. So if I look at RS, those are the first two letters. Those match up with XY, the second two letters. So those have to be congruent. And then the last two letters, ST and YZ. So ST and YZ have to be congruent. And then the outer letters, so RT and XZ have to be congruent. So again, looking at the congruent statement for the order, or you could just look at the number of arcs that you've used for the angles to identify your congruent pairs of sides. So now that I have everything marked, well, filling in these blanks is easy because it's basically just from here, just fill in the appropriate angle based on your marking. So if I have angle R, well, that's going to match up with angle X. I can just look at the picture now that I have it marked. But keep in mind, you could always go back to the original statement too and look at the order. RS is congruent to XY. And YZ is congruent to TS. And notice when I talk about the segments, I don't really have to worry about the letters matching up because the segments are the same. But when you talk about the congruent triangles, you have to make sure that if R and X are in the same position, they match up in the statement. But if you look here, YZ, I went from Y to Z, but then if you look up top, Y and Z are in the, it goes middle to last, but then it really should have been S and T. But if I say TS, it's still correct. So I purposely did that to show you that the corresponding letters aren't in the same position for the segment, but it's still correct because there's still only one segment from S to T or T to S. It's the same thing. And then angle Y is going to match up with angle S. Angle T is going to match up with angle Z. Notice my notation. I'm keeping the little angle symbols. RT matches up with segment XZ, or you could say ZX. It doesn't matter. And you put the little bar above that. Now when I get into the triangles is where I have to be really careful about the letters. So triangle, what I usually do is just do one letter at a time. So S matches up with Y. T matches up with Z, and then R matches up with X. So it's important that you make sure that you're matching them up correctly. And again, I could have looked at the original statement or look at the picture. Last one here, angle Z is going to match up with angle T. And then point Y is in the same position as point S. and then point X is in the same position as R. So there we have it. If we look at one more example, this is an example where it's definitely very difficult to see from the picture what parts match up. So this is where using your congruence statement is going to be very important. So the first thing I want to do here is, since this picture has multiple triangles, the first thing I want to do is let's just highlight the two triangles we're talking about so we can just look at that. So we have ACD, so triangle ACD. So that means it's really this triangle here. We got to connect back to A. And then CAB, so C to A to B. So there's my two triangles. So that already kind of helps me visualize the two triangles I'm supposed to be looking at, because there were several different triangles in the picture. And we want to list all the pairs of congruent parts. So if we start with looking at our letters here, A and C are in the same position. So that really means A in this first triangle, the vertex at A, is in the same position as C in the other triangle. So that really means I can't say angle A and angle C because there's too many angles that share vertex A and too many angles that share vertex C. But what I have to do is use three letters. So I could say angle DAC is congruent to angle BCA. Again, making sure that those middle letters match up, the A and the C, because those are the vertices. Then I can go on to the next pair here. So angle C, or the angle who shares vertex C in the yellow triangle, is congruent to the angle who shares vertex A in the blue triangle, which again means I need to use three letters when I talk about those. So DCA, or yep, DCA would be the double arc, and then BAC. And then from there, we can look at the last letters here. So D and B. Again, so it's D matches up the entire angle in the yellow triangle and then the entire angle in the blue triangle, which is important to make sure that when you're doing these, that you identify the triangles first, so that when you go to identify the angles, you're making sure you're looking at the correct picture, or the correct angle, because there's lots of angles who share vertex D and vertex B. So now when I go to name those, again, I'm going to use three letters. So ADC is congruent to angle CBA. So using three letters, if you're ever unsure, you should just use three letters. But the rule really is, if there's more than one angle sharing that same vertex, you can't name the angle just by the vertex. You have to use three letters. Versus up top here, angle R and angle X, there's only one angle at vertex R, and there's only one angle at vertex X. That's why I could just name it using the vertex. Remember, the other option too is to put numbers in there and use numbers to name them. But for the sake of this, I wanted to use the letters since we're really talking about the ordering of the letters. So then from here, we can talk about the sides. So we can look at our order right here. So AC and CA have to match up. So AC and CA. Since this is a shared side between both triangles, typically we mark that with an X. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's a common way to mark that since it's shared. So AC is congruent to CA. We have CD and AB. So CD and AB. And then lastly, the outer letters. So AD and CB. And again, you could also just look at your angle arcs as well. So AD and BC. So I could have just said single to triple have to match up. So there's all of your corresponding parts. There's 6, 3 angles, 3 sides. And before we end this, I want to just make sure, let's make a note here that order of the letters does matter. So order of the letters matters. So pay attention to that when you're doing your check your understanding problems. The order matters. So go ahead, get some key ideas written down, and then complete your check your understanding problems, and we will talk about those in class tomorrow.